When you think everything is under control, but temptation is closer than it seems. Sarah stood by the window, enveloped in silence. Darkness hugged the room, and the only source of light was the screen of her phone, trembling in her hand. A message illuminated the display. "Are you sure about this? It could change everything." Her heart pounded so loudly she was sure Mike, in the next room, could hear it. She began typing a reply but stopped. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. The words she had already written didn't feel right. Exhaling deeply, Sarah erased the message. Her mind and emotions wrestled within her. She kept repeating to herself, "This is wrong. But when was the last time you felt alive?" Her thoughts were interrupted by Mike's voice. "Are you okay?" Sarah flinched. She quickly pressed the lock button on her phone and replied hurriedly, "Yeah, I just can't sleep." She pulled the blanket over herself as if trying to hide from her emotions. Mike sighed but said nothing more. His footsteps gradually faded down the hallway. Sarah sat on the edge of the bed, clutching her phone so tightly her knuckles turned white. She unlocked the screen again. The message was still there, staring back at her. "You can't do this," her mind urged. "But you want to." Her heart countered. Her gaze fell on the nightstand lamp. She recalled moments when Mike was her everything, but that was long ago. Now, all she felt was the cold abyss between them. Exhaling once more, Sarah placed the phone on the nightstand. Her fingers lingered on it for a few moments, unwilling to let it go. She lay down under the blanket, closed her eyes, and tried to sleep. "It's just a message. It doesn't mean anything if I don't reply," she tried to convince herself. But sleep didn't come. Her thoughts kept returning to her last encounter with Alex. She remembered his gaze, deep and penetrating, as if he could see right through her. His voice, which still echoed in her mind, seemed to whisper in her ear, "You deserve more than what you have." Sarah turned to the other side. In the next room, Mike snored softly. The voice in her mind returned. "He wouldn't even notice if you were gone for an hour. And Alex, he's waiting." Morning arrived faster than she wanted. She had barely slept, replaying countless scenarios in her mind. What if she replied? What if it ruined her marriage? What if? Sarah walked into the kitchen and turned on the coffee maker. Her movements were mechanical, while her thoughts were still trapped in the previous evening. She unlocked her phone and saw a new message from Alex. "Leaving me hanging? That's not like you. Let's meet tonight. 8 p.m. I know you want to." She stared at the screen, feeling her chest tighten. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, clutching a steaming cup of coffee. Her eyes were fixed on the phone lying next to her. Alex's message still glowed on the screen, testing her resolve. She stared at it for a long time, as if expecting the answer to materialize on its own. Her inner voice spoke again. "You know what you want. You feel it every time you think of him. You've been living with this thought for weeks. Just reply." Sarah placed her cup down and picked up her phone. Her fingers quickly typed out a message. "All right, I'll come." She hit send and immediately felt her heart race. A mix of excitement and fear coursed through her. The phone vibrated almost instantly. The reply was brief. "I'll be waiting for you. It will be a special night." Sarah approached the mirror in the bathroom. She stared at her reflection for a long time, as if trying to understand who she truly was. "It's just a meeting. Nothing more," she whispered to herself. But deep inside, she knew it wasn't true. Choosing a dress for the evening, her hands trembled. Sarah settled on a simple, yet elegant black dress that accentuated her figure. She tried not to think about how this meeting could change her life forever. Sarah stood before the door that opened into another world. Alex greeted her with a smile that could melt ice. His gaze swept over her, and in his eyes, she saw something she hadn't seen in Mike's for a long time. "You look stunning," he said, offering her a glass of wine. Their evening began with light conversations, but the tension between them grew. Every glance, every gesture filled the space between them with invisible energy. "Sarah," Alex said softly, leaning closer, "you can say stop at any moment, but I know you don't want to." Sarah looked into his eyes, and for a moment, the entire world ceased to exist. Her voice barely whispered, "I don't want to stop." Sarah and Alex sat on the couch, glasses of wine resting on a small table nearby. Her fingers traced the thin rim of her glass, but her thoughts were far from the wine. She could feel the warmth of his presence next to her, almost physical, as if he were touching her. Their eyes met. In his gaze, there was something more than mere curiosity. She saw desire, deep and uncompromising, that made her heart race faster. Alex leaned closer, placing his hand over hers. His touch was light, but it burned like fire. "You know this is right," he whispered, his voice so soft that Sarah felt it penetrate her very soul. Sarah closed her eyes for a second, as if trying to escape what was happening. Her mind was trapped between what she wanted to do and what she was supposed to do. But suddenly, the sharp sound of her phone shattered the silence into pieces. Her hand jerked as she hastily grabbed the device from the table without even looking at the screen. Her voice trembled as she answered. "Hello." On the other end, she heard Mike's voice. He sounded anxious, almost nervous. "Sarah, where are you? I've been looking for you." Sarah closed her eyes, trying to keep the wave of panic from overtaking her. Her voice sounded artificially calm. I decided to go for a walk." "A walk?" Mike didn't hide his disbelief. "At 8:30 at night?" She glanced quickly at Alex, who was calmly watching her, his head resting on his hand. His gaze seemed almost amused, as if he took pleasure in how the situation spiraled out of control. "Everything's fine. I just needed some fresh air," Sarah continued, feeling sweat break out on her palms. On the other end, Mike was silent, as if considering her words. Then he said, "Are you sure you're okay?" Those words made her shiver. Alex leaned closer and whispered softly, "Tell him you're with me." His voice was quiet, but it carried a certainty that sent chills down her spine. Sarah quickly put her hand over his mouth, looking at him in horror. Her heart pounded so hard, she could hear its echo in her ears. "Everything's fine, Mike," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "Just trust me, okay? I'll be home soon." Mike was silent again before finally saying, "All right, but we'll talk when you get back." When the call ended, Sarah placed the phone on the table. The room filled with silence, but it was so tense it felt like it could explode at any moment. Alex leaned in closer to her, his smile barely noticeable, but his eyes gleamed with challenge. "You're working so hard to hide this," he said quietly, "but I think you enjoy the risk." His words cut through her like a knife. Sarah took a deeper breath, trying to compose herself. Her gaze met his, and she saw something she couldn't deny. The truth. "Alex," she began, but he interrupted her. "You don't need to explain, Sarah. You're already here." He leaned in closer, and she felt her remaining doubts melt away, leaving only one thing: desire. Sarah and Alex sat on the couch. Her fingers nervously gripped her wine glass, though she hadn't touched the drink. Alex leaned in closer, his hand brushing against hers. Her heart skipped a beat. "You know this is right?" Alex whispered, his voice soft and persuasive, like silk. Sarah closed her eyes, trying to escape his words, but it was futile. Her thoughts had been living in this moment since the day they first met. And suddenly, the sharp ring of her phone shattered the tense silence. Sarah flinched, grabbing the device hastily from the table without even glancing at the screen. "Hello." Her voice was trembling. "Sarah." Mike's voice was sharp and anxious. "Where are you? Why am I looking for you?" Sarah felt her sweaty palms tighten around the phone. She glanced at Alex, who sat calmly, watching her with curiosity. I decided to take a walk," she replied, trying to sound composed. "A walk? At 8:30 at night? Are you serious?" Mike's sarcastic laugh followed. "Is this what you call normal behavior?" Sarah closed her eyes, trying not to snap. "Everything's fine, Mike. Just trust me, okay?" "Trust you? After the way you've been acting lately?" His voice turned cold and sharp. "You're not yourself, Sarah. You barely talk to me, but now you suddenly decide to take a walk?" Her heart sank. She could feel Alex's gaze, silently stoking the fire with his presence. "Mike, stop." She tried to sound gentle, but her voice was strained. "I'll be home soon, and we'll talk." "Talk? You don't even want to have a conversation," Mike practically shouted. "What's going on, Sarah? Tell me the truth." Alex leaned in closer and whispered, "Just hang up." Sarah quickly pressed her hand to his mouth, looking at him with horror. Her voice grew more determined. "Mike, stop. I'm not ready for this right now. Trust me, okay?" Mike was silent for a few seconds, then snapped, "You know, Sarah, maybe I'm wasting my time trying to save this marriage." Her heart pounded even faster. He hung up without waiting for a response. Sarah set the phone down on the table. The room was once again filled with tense silence. Alex raised his glass, took a sip, and looked at her as he said, "He doesn't appreciate you." His words, "That's not love." Sarah sighed, trying to pull herself together. "I can't do this, Alex." He leaned in closer, his voice tender. "But you want to. Just admit it to yourself." Her hands trembled. Sarah sat staring at the darkened phone, her thoughts a chaotic storm raging inside her. Her hands were still shaking from the conversation with Mike. Alex sat beside her, calm as if the situation didn't faze him at all. A faint smile touched his lips, as if he knew something she didn't. Suddenly, the phone vibrated again on the table, shattering the silence like a hammer striking glass. Sarah flinched, grabbed the device, and saw Mike's name on the screen. Her heart pounded in her chest as though danger were imminent. "Don't answer," Alex said softly, his gaze steady and composed. Ignoring him, Sarah pressed the button to take the call. Her voice trembled as she spoke. "Hello. Are you still out for your walk?" Mike's voice was sharp, almost icy. "Sarah, I can't take this anymore." "Where are you really?" "Mike, I already told you," she started, but his voice cut her off. "Don't lie to me." His shout made her flinch. "I can hear someone talking near you." "Who is it?" For a moment, Sarah was at a loss for words. Alex stood up, crossing his arms, tilting his head as if to say, "Your move." It's just the TV," she lied, scrambling for an excuse. "The TV? At 9:30 at night, while you're out walking?" Mike's voice dripped with sarcasm. "Sarah, tell me the truth now." She closed her eyes, gripping the phone so tightly it nearly slipped from her hands. "I can't talk right now, Mike. Just trust me." "Trust you?" His voice was now filled with anger and frustration. "How can I trust you when you can't even say where you are?" "Sarah, if you don't tell me the truth, I'll know you've betrayed me." His words hit her like a bolt of lightning. Her eyes widened, her breath quickened. Alex, observing her reaction, slowly approached her, his voice calm and soothing. "Hang up. He doesn't understand you." Sarah looked at him, her gaze filled with fear and despair. But something inside her shifted. "Mike, you can't resolve this right now. I'll come home and we'll talk," she said firmly and hung up, not waiting for his response. She sat staring at her trembling hands. Alex leaned down, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "That was the right choice," he said with such confidence that she almost believed him. But deep inside, a question tormented her. "What will happen when I go home?" Sarah sat, staring at the message on her phone screen. Her eyes slowly filled with tears, and her fingers, still holding the wine glass, nearly let it slip. She placed the glass on the table and pressed her hands to her face, trying to stave off panic. Alex, sitting beside her, leaned closer. His hand gently touched her shoulder, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. "What's wrong?" Sarah looked at him. Her face was tense, her eyes filled with despair. She held out the phone to him silently, showing him the message. Alex read the text carefully. He placed the phone back on the table and looked at Sarah with a gaze that was firm but compassionate. "He knows," she finally whispered, her voice breaking. "It doesn't matter," Alex said calmly. "He can't keep you trapped in fear." Sarah sighed, struggling to process the weight of her emotions. Her hands trembled as she ran her fingers through her hair, as if it might help her pull herself together. "It's not that simple, Alex." Her voice faltered, and she didn't finish the sentence. Alex leaned in closer, his voice soft but resolute. "You have to make a choice. Now." Sarah looked up at him. Her gaze was a mixture of fear, guilt, and uncertainty. "How can I choose? I can't just leave everything we've built." "But," her voice trailed off, and she closed her eyes as if trying to escape her own words. Alex watched her closely, his hand still on her shoulder. He spoke quietly. Are you happy with him? The question cut into her heart like a blade. She averted her gaze, unable to answer. She stepped back a few paces, nervously shaking her head. Her thoughts were chaotic. I can't do this. I can't. She grabbed her phone and walked to another room, leaving Alex alone with the silence. Mike parked in front of the building. He got out of the car and stopped, staring at the building before him. His breathing was deep, and anger boiled within him. If this is true, he thought. He called James again. Tell me, which building was it? The fourth one. They definitely went inside. Mike, without saying another word, put his phone in his pocket and approached the door. His steps were heavy, determined. He found the apartment using James's directions and knocked on the door. Sarah heard the knock and froze. She stopped in the hallway, her face tense. Alex glanced at the door and smiled faintly. Is it him? Sarah nodded, her hands trembling. What should I do? She whispered. Alex stepped closer to her, his voice firm. It's your decision, but I'm not afraid to speak the truth. The knocking grew louder, and Mike's voice came through the wooden door. Sarah, I know you're in there. Open up. Sarah looked at Alex, her eyes filled with fear. Alex walked to the door and opened it. Mike stood on the doorstep, his face red with anger. He met Alex's gaze, and tension immediately filled the space between them. Who are you? Mike's voice was low and cold. Alex replied calmly. I'm the one trying to give Sarah what you couldn't. Those words were like a spark to a flame. Mike lunged forward, but Sarah stopped him, stepping between the two men. Stop, she yelled. This isn't what you think. Then tell me what it is, Mike snapped, his gaze fixed on her. Sarah stood in the bathroom, trying to calm herself. Her hands gripped her phone as she stared at Mike's message. Her thoughts swirled in a storm of fear and despair. She couldn't understand how things had escalated to this. She lifted her head and looked in the mirror. Her eyes reflected a struggle between the desire to be free and the fear of losing what she had built. I'll just go back home and explain everything, she thought. But as she glanced back at her phone screen, there was a new message. Not from Mike. I know where you are. We'll talk now. Alex. Sarah froze. Her heart raced faster than before. How could he know? She quickly left the bathroom to find Mike, but she stopped in the hallway. Alex stood in his office, staring at his phone. On the screen was a map showing Sarah's location through an app he had installed months ago without telling her. He spoke aloud. You can't fool me anymore, Sarah. Alex grabbed his jacket and keys. His anger, which had been boiling inside, began to shift into cold determination. Sarah heard a knock at the door. She froze, her eyes widening in fear. Alex stood up from the couch, looking at the door, and smiled faintly. Who is it? He asked calmly, though he already had a good idea. Sarah didn't respond. She approached the door but didn't manage to open it before a voice came through. Open up, Sarah. I know you're in there. It was Mike. His voice was filled with anger, and every word sounded like a challenge. Sarah turned to Alex, her voice trembling. What should I do? It's your decision, Alex replied, crossing his arms over his chest. But I'm ready to talk to him if you want me to. No, she said quickly. That'll only make things worse. The knocking on the door grew louder, and Mike's voice came through again. Sarah, open the door, or I'll break it down. Alex sighed, walked to the door, and abruptly opened it. Finally, Mike said, locking eyes with Alex. Their gazes clashed, and the tension in the air became almost palpable. Who are you? Mike asked, his voice low and cold. I'm the one ready to give her what you couldn't, Alex replied calmly, as if it were just a casual conversation. Mike stepped forward, but Sarah moved between them. Stop, she yelled. Neither of you knows everything. Then explain it, Mike demanded, his gaze fixed directly on her. I want to hear it from you. As Sarah tried to gather her thoughts, her phone vibrated again. She saw a new message from a third party. I know what's happening. I'll tell everything if you don't meet me. You have 1 hour. The choice is yours. Sarah read it, and her face grew even paler. Both Alex and Mike noticed her reaction and simultaneously asked, What's wrong? She didn't answer, just clutched the phone, feeling the situation spiraling out of control. Mike stepped into the apartment without waiting for an invitation. His eyes landed on Sarah before quickly shifting to Alex. "So, it's you?" Mike said, his voice cold but laced with explosive tension. "This is the guy you spend your evenings with while I'm at home trying to figure out what went wrong?" Alex stood calmly across from him, his arms crossed. His posture was relaxed, but his gaze was defiant. "Maybe you should ask yourself why she's here and not at home with you," he replied evenly. Sarah stepped forward, trying to defuse the situation. "Stop. This isn't what you think." Mike spun toward her, his eyes blazing with anger. "Then tell me what it is, Sarah. Explain to me how we ended up here, in this man's apartment." Sarah closed her eyes, trying to collect herself. Her voice trembled. "Mike, I'm confused." "Confused?" He interrupted, stepping closer. "So confused that you decided to betray me?" Alex stepped between them, his voice calm but with a steel edge. "Don't yell at her. She has the right to her own feelings." "The right?" Mike laughed bitterly. "And you're the one telling me this? The guy who's probably been planning this all along?" Alex raised his hands as if to calm the situation. "I simply gave her what you clearly couldn't." Those words were the breaking point. Mike lunged forward, grabbing Alex by the collar. "You don't even know what you're talking about." "And do you?" Alex shot back, meeting his gaze. "Have you ever even paid attention to what she wants?" Sarah intervened, pushing Mike back. "Stop it, both of you. This won't help anything." She stood between them, her face streaked with tears and filled with despair. "You both think you know what I want? But neither of you has even asked me," she yelled. Both men fell silent, staring at her. Mike stepped closer, his voice quiet but brimming with emotion. "Fine. Then tell me, Sarah, what do you want? Do you want to be with him?" Sarah looked at Alex, then at Mike. Her hands clenched into fists, and her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know," she finally whispered. Mike stepped back, his face hardening. "You don't know? After everything we've been through, you don't know?" Alex, looking at her, said quietly, "You've already made your choice, Sarah. Just admit it." Mike turned to him, his voice low. "You think this is going to end the way you want? You're just another mistake she's made." "Maybe so," Alex shrugged. "But at least I'm not keeping her in a cage." Sarah's phone vibrated again. She looked at the screen and saw a new message. "Stop both of them, or I'll tell everything. You know who I am. You have 1 hour." Sarah froze. Her heart seemed to stop. She showed the message to both men. Mike snatched the phone and read the message. "Who is this?" His voice was filled with anger and unease. Alex read the text, his face remaining unreadable. "It doesn't matter," he said. "What matters is that together, we can figure this out." Sarah looked at both men, her mind in turmoil. Sarah stood frozen, staring at the two men. Her face was pale, her eyes filled with fear. She tried to make sense of what was happening, but the situation only grew more complicated. Mike held up the phone, reread the message, and nodded toward Alex. "This is your game, isn't it? You're trying to scare her?" Alex slowly raised his hands, taking a step back. "Me? Are you serious? If anyone here is manipulating, it's definitely not me." "Then who?" Mike took a step toward him, but Sarah stopped him. "Stop it, both of you," she yelled, her voice trembling. "I don't know who it is, and I don't want you two killing each other." Alex met Mike's gaze and, despite the tension between them, said, "If it's not me or you, then maybe we're dealing with someone who's been watching all of us." Mike frowned, his voice deepening. "What are you talking about?" "Someone knows about us," Alex replied calmly, pointing at the message on the phone. "About you, about me, about her. And this person is playing their own game." Sarah looked at them with a mix of fear and despair. "What do we do now?" Mike took a deep breath and, for the first time, looked away from Alex. He seemed slightly calmer. "We need to find out who this is." Alex nodded. "But we won't be able to do that if we're at each other's throats." Sarah sank onto the couch, her hands trembling. She looked at both men and felt that this might be her only chance to fix everything. Mike sat across from Sarah, his voice cold. "Fine. Do you have any ideas?" Alex pulled out his phone and began typing quickly. "I'll check if we can trace where the message came from. If it's someone nearby, we might be able to find out who." And what are you planning to do? Mike asked sarcastically. Whatever it takes to protect her, Alex replied, not looking up from his screen. Listening to their conversation, Sarah felt a strange mixture of emotions. On one hand, she was struck by how the two men were now working together. On the other hand, it reminded her just how far out of control things had spiraled. Alex's phone vibrated. He looked closely at the screen and said, "The message was sent from a device using software to hide the number. Whoever it is, they know what they're doing." Mike leaned closer, his face tense. "Are you saying it could be one of us?" Alex looked straight at him. "I'm saying it could be anyone." At that moment, there was a knock at the apartment door. All three froze. "Who is that?" Mike asked sharply, looking at Sarah. Alex approached the door, but before he could open it, Sarah whispered, "Wait." She walked to the door and looked through the peephole. Standing outside was a figure she didn't recognize. Turning back to the men, she said, "It's not Mike, and it's not you. Who could it be?" The knock came again, harder this time. A voice from behind the door said, "Open up, Sarah. We need to talk." The voice made her heart stop. She opened the door, and standing there was a man she hadn't seen in a long time. "James!" she exclaimed. He pulled out his phone and typed something for a few seconds. Then he looked up at James. "Imagine how easy it would be for me to find out what you've been up to, James. The stakes always have two sides, don't they?" James's expression hardened, but he tried to remain composed. "You think you can scare me?" "I think you didn't expect someone here to play as hard as you do," Alex replied, his voice sharp as a knife. Sarah saw the tension between the men escalating. She raised her hands, trying to stop them. "Stop it. This isn't helping." "No, Sarah," Alex said, keeping his eyes on James. "He thinks he has control over you, but he doesn't." "I've had enough," Mike interrupted, his voice rough. "I want to know what you're after, James." "Fine." James raised his hands as if surrendering. "It's simple. I want Sarah to confess. Let her say what's between you two, and let Mike decide what to do next." Alex, without hesitation, responded, "If you think you can use this to manipulate her, forget it. She won't tell you anything while you hold this dirty blackmail over her." "And what are you going to do?" James asked, smirking. Alex stepped closer, his voice low but resolute. "I'll find every weakness you have and use it against you. You'll lose everything if you don't stop this now." James sighed, his smile fading. "Fine, you have a point, but I don't believe you can do it without her help." "Then try me," Alex replied, staring directly into his eyes. James finally nodded, as if conceding. "Fine, I'll destroy everything I have. But," he turned to Mike, "if you really want to know the truth, ask her." James walked out of the room, leaving the three of them in tense silence. Mike looked at Sarah, his voice harsh. "Is he telling the truth? Are you with him?" Sarah looked up, her heart racing. She knew there was no avoiding the question now. Sarah stood motionless, her hands clenched into fists. All eyes were on her. Mike's, full of anger and pain, and Alex's, calm but tense. The silence in the room was unbearable. She took a deep breath, her voice trembling as she began to speak. "Yes, there was something between us." Mike lifted his head, his eyes narrowing. "Something? You mean, you were with him?" Sarah looked at Alex, then back at Mike. Her gaze was filled with remorse. "It started when I felt lost. When things between us, Mike, started falling apart." "Falling apart?" Mike interrupted, his voice growing louder with every word. "And that's your excuse?" "No," Sarah snapped, her voice suddenly stronger. "It's not an excuse. I didn't know what else to do." She stepped toward him, her voice softening. "You were so far away from me, Mike. You didn't see how hard I tried to hold us together." Mike stepped back, his face hardening. "So you decided to go to him instead?" Alex intervened, his voice calm but firm. "She didn't go to me. This was more than just an affair." "Stay out of this," Mike said sharply, his eyes never leaving Sarah. "You were my wife, Sarah. You swore loyalty to me, and I tried to keep that promise." She cried, her voice shaking. "But it couldn't last, Mike. I lost myself." Sarah lowered her head, tears streaming down her cheeks. "I know this is my fault, but I couldn't keep living the way we were. Mike stayed silent. His face remained tense, but his eyes betrayed how deeply her words struck him. And now what? He finally asked. Sarah raised her head, her gaze full of pain. I don't know. Alex took a step forward but stopped when Mike raised his hand. You've done your part. Now let her decide what she wants. Mike turned back to Sarah, his voice quiet. Sarah, I can't fight for us alone if you don't want to. Sarah found herself at a crossroads. She looked at Mike, the man she had spent so many years with, and Alex, the man who had made her feel alive again. Her voice was barely audible. Before she could finish, the phone on the table vibrated again. All three looked at it. It was a new message from James. I'm always nearby, and this isn't over. Her heart sank as she read the words. Sarah stood there, feeling torn between two worlds, her past and her present, love and passion, duty and desire. She looked at Mike and then at Alex. Her heart felt heavy, but at last, she made her decision. She stepped toward Mike, her voice soft but firm. Mike, I know what I've done, and I'm not asking for your forgiveness right away, but I want to try to fix this. Mike looked at her silently, his eyes filled with mixed emotions. After a long pause, he said, It won't be easy, Sarah. I know, she replied, her eyes brimming with tears. But I'm willing to fight for us if you're willing to as well. Mike lowered his head, sighing, and then looked back at her. We'll start from scratch. But this is your last chance, Sarah. Sarah nodded, tears streaming down her cheeks. She turned to Alex, her voice filled with gratitude. Thank you for everything, Alex. But I need to save what I have. Alex stayed silent, his face unreadable. After a pause, he simply nodded, his voice soft. Then be happy, Sarah. He turned and walked out of the apartment, leaving her with Mike. Sarah and Mike stood in silence, looking at each other. She took a step toward him, gently touching his hand. He allowed it, but his face remained serious. This is going to be hard, he repeated. But we'll get through it, she said, looking into his eyes. The camera focuses on their hands, slowly and cautiously clasping each other. Sarah made her choice, but will her decision be the right one? What do you think about this story? Share your thoughts in the comments.